Chapter 3. Translating and Revising Scripture. Too often overzealous and misinformed preachers of today profess to have a Bible without error. However, any honest Christian scholar will admit mistakes and inaccuracies in all Bible translations. Perhaps the erudite scholars of Bible history said it best when they declared, "The need for NT textual criticism results from a combination of three factors. 1. The originals, probably written on papyrus scrolls, have all perished. 2. For over 1,400 years the NT was copied by hand, and the copyists, scribes, made every conceivable error, as well as at time intentionally altering, probably with the idea of correcting, the text. Such errors and alterations survived in various ways, with a basic tendency to accumulate. Scribes seldom left anything out, lest they omit something inspired. 3. There are now extant, in whole or in part, 5,338 Greek MSS, as well as hundreds of copies of ancient translations, not counting over 8,000 copies of the Latin Vulgate, plus the evidence from the citations of the NT and the writings of the early Church Fathers. Moreover, no two MSS anywhere in existence are exactly alike. Biblical Criticism, Harrison, Waltke, Guthrie and Fee, page 128. This is not the overwhelming evidence as to the accuracy and harmony of the Bible which our modern divines proclaim, but rather the understanding of scholarly and qualified textual critics. The translators themselves are responsible for most of the errors in the Bible, so we must look to where and how they came about. There is a definite need for textual critics, and for the exposure of errors they find. The principal errors in translation can be classified into three main categories. 1. Changes in words, numbers, and dates. 2. Inconsistencies within its history. 3. Contradictions in its teachings. Summarized in this chapter are 41 of the main problems encountered in making a correct translation of the Bible from ancient manuscripts. 1. Language transmission. To begin with, the translation of any ancient language into another cannot be absolutely accurate, regardless of how well-versed the scribe may be. Scholars all agree that even certain features of Greek syntax and vocabulary are difficult or impossible to convey in translation, which is the language of the New Testament. 2. Word transmission. Anyone familiar with foreign languages knows that many words in a language cannot be directly changed into words of another language with exactly the same meaning. Every language has its own word peculiarities, which are often very difficult, if not impossible, to change into another language. 3. Homonym errors. In every language there are words that sound alike but mean different things. Some examples in English are words such as beat and beat, or a person could saw a log or he saw a parade. Whole is written for whole, it's for its, to get aboard or to be bored. Often the word way is written for way, and to are mistakenly used interchangeably because of the similarity of sound. These and similar homonyms have been frequently found in Bible translations. 4. Haplography errors. This means writing once what should have been written twice. This has occurred in the Bible with letters, words, and portions of sentences. 5. Dautography errors. This is a common transcriptional error, writing twice what should be written only once. This error has been noted in Ezekiel, Isaiah, Psalms, and other early manuscripts, but many later translators have corrected the error when writing it in English. 6. Metathesis. This is the inadvertent exchange of the proper order of letters or words, and it can significantly change meaning. In Isaiah 32:19 it originally read, "The forest will fall." Instead, it was incorrectly translated, "The city is leveled." In Ezekiel 42:16, the original number was obviously wrong, and had to be corrected by translators to read 500 rather than 5 cubits. 7. Fusion. This is combining the last letter of the first word with the first letter of the following word. In Hebrew this can be and has been a serious error. 8. Fission. This is the improper separation of one word into two words. This has been found in verses such as Isaiah 61:1, with the last word in Isaiah 2:20, and also in other places. 9. Misreading handwriting. In nearly all languages there are several letters which are similar in appearance and are easily mistaken. Anciently this was a problem because of poor writing materials and the variations of handwriting. Age of manuscripts would mar or obliterate important letters or words, making it difficult to know what was written. Misreading the handwriting and copying even the same language is easily done. In the Hebrew writing this is a particularly common problem. 10. Homoeotoleuton. This Greek word means having the same ending. Sometimes the loss of a text can result when the eye of the copyist passes over all the words preceding a final phrase, which may be identical with one which closes the sentence preceding it or following after it. These have been found in Isaiah, Psalms, and elsewhere. 11. Homoarctin. This means that which has a similar beginning. This too involves losses of intervening words, as the eye of the scribe jumps from one beginning to another. This is often a situation which has caused the loss of a substantial number of words in the translation. 12. Omission of words. This is the occasional loss of a word because it was accidentally missed, or because it was unreadable and purposely left blank. Such an example was I Samuel 13:1, which in the MSS said, Saul was years old when he began to reign. This was filled in by scholars who used clues and calculations to provide the omitted information, whether correct or incorrect. In some instances, this is impossible to do accurately. 13. Dead language words. Some Hebrew words are not known in today's language even to Jewish scholars. For instance, the creature mentioned in Deut. 14:5-6, the diseases in Deut. 28:22, or the names of the stones in Exodus 28. Are all part of a lost or dead language. 14. Absence of vowels. The vowels and accents of Hebrew were not in the language of the Bible. Thus, it is easy to understand how a word could have been interpreted differently. For example, in English, brn might be read barn, born, burn, briny, barony, etc. And if there were no vowel marks to indicate the sound, we should have to be taught, like the Jews, which word the writer intended. Here, for example, are two Hebrew words in Deuteronomy, Bzr and Psgh, which in our Hebrew Bible read Bezer and Pisgah, but which the Septuagint translators render Bozer and Pasgah. Old documents in the New Bible are Etzenhauser, page 7-8. Vowels were not even used until about the 7th and 8th century. Syriac and Arabic writing had a similar delay for vowels in their writing. Many Bible difficulties result from a minor error on the part of a copyist in the transmission of the text. In the Old Testament, such transmissional errors may have resulted from a poor reading of the vowels. Hebrew was originally written in consonants only, and the vowel signs were not added until 1,000 years after the completion of the Old Testament canon. But there are also some consonants that are easily confused because they look so much alike. Besides that, some words are preserved in a very old spelling susceptible of misunderstanding by later Hebrew copyists. Bible difficulties, Gleason L. Archer, page 16. 15. Continuous letters. Another cause of error in translating ancient texts was the dividing of words that had been written that had been originally all run together in a continuous line. For example, Comesiam and Wichteld Mealthings Thadaveridid. 1. Etzenhauser gives a simple explanation of this particular method of mistranslation. Again, in ancient manuscripts, where there is often no division between the words, each line presenting a continuous row of letters, it might easily happen that one word would be wrongly divided into two, or two combined into one, as in the old story of the infidel who wrote over his bed, God is nowhere, which was read by his little boy as, God is now here. Old documents in the New Bible, pages 20-21. 16. Language variants. Aramaic is a kindred language to Hebrew, and about 500 BC, it became the spoken language of the common man around Palestine. Since Aramaic was spoken by most Jews several centuries before Christ, it explains why some Old Testament portions were found written in the Aramaic language. Even the appearance of the Aramaic and Hebrew letters are almost identical, and yet they are two different languages. The Aramaic language was used for many centuries, and was the written and spoken language of Christ and his disciples. However, although Aramaic was spoken by Christ, the books of the New Testament were usually written in Greek, as the writers wanted to translate into a more commonly used language. In the 1st century, Greek was the universal language, just as English today is fairly universal around the world. Since the Bible was mostly written in these three languages, we have three variants of expression and interpretations. 17. Word meaning. If all of the Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Syriac texts had been translated from one single text, there would still remain possible variations due to the choice of words in translating. Every scribe has his own style of vocabulary and types of descriptions and expression. Each translator tries to express the original meaning which he thinks was intended by the person who wrote the text. Hence, many scribes differed in their interpretation of the original text language, even though they were translating the very same words. Each had a slightly different understanding of the original meaning of the words written by the author. Consider how confused a foreigner must be when he reads in a daily American newspaper. The prospectors made a strike yesterday up in the mountains. The union went on strike this morning. Strike up with the Star-Spangled Banner. The fishermen got a good strike in the middle of the lake. Presumably each of these completely different uses of the same word go back to the same parent and have the same etymology. But complete confusion may result from misunderstanding how the speaker meant the word to be used. Bear in mind that inerrancy involves acceptance of and belief in whatever the biblical author meant by the words he used. If he meant what he said in a literal way, it is wrong to take it figuratively, but if he meant what he said in a figurative way, it is wrong to take it literally. So we must engage in careful exegesis in order to find out what he meant in the light of contemporary conditions and usage. Bible difficulties, Gleason L. Archer, page 16. 18. Limited education. Each translator has a different form and level of education, thereby limiting his translating ability. Words take on meanings that were learned through various types of schooling. Just as the great variety of English Bibles reflects the philosophies and abilities of the translators, so also the variants in the ancient MSS reflect the philosophies and abilities of the scribes who produced them. Biblical criticism, Harrison, etc., page 48. This created variations in meaning among the Catholics, Protestants, Jews, agnostics, and antagonists. 19. Marginal corrections. Parchment was expensive and very scarce, so when scribes used this medium for writing, the lines were very close together. If a correction had to be made, it was usually made in the margin. However, they often made their own comments in the margin as well. Thus, it later became difficult to distinguish a personal comment from a correction. Dr. Roberts says, mere glosses, doxologies, or liturgical formularies, written on the margin of manuscripts, were sometimes inadvertently introduced by transcribers into the text. Thus, an unwarranted explanation has been admitted at John 5:3-4, the omission of which in the Revised Version, on good grounds of evidence, relieves the passage of an obvious difficulty. The doxology of the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6:13, which seems to have been quite unknown to the early fathers of the Church, probably crept into the text from the margin in like manner. Companion to the Revised Version of the English New Testament, pages 7-8. 20. Meaning differences by classes. Some of the Greek words of the New Testament period have uncertain meanings, the reason being that languages change and assume new meanings. There are also different language meanings by various classes of people living at the same time, as explained by Professor Goodspeed. The New Testament was written not in classical Greek, nor in the biblical Greek of the Greek version of the Old Testament, nor even in the literary Greek of its own day, but in the common language of everyday life. The writers of the New Testament had for the most part little use for literary art. Preface to the Goodspeed NT Bible. 21. Misinterpreting definitions. The Greek Testament contains nearly 900 words, which are not found in the classical Greek. This represents about 1/6 of its vocabulary without definition. To illustrate in modern English, a newspaper may report that a group of people were gay, which could be interpreted either to mean happy or sexually perverted, depending on the translator's understanding. The writers of the New Testament wrote in the common language of their day, which is not easily interpreted to our understanding. 22. Language changes. Language changes also occurred as copies were made of copies. It is not always easy to determine the original meaning of a text which is derived from one or more translations, the original of which had been copied an unknown number of times in a language that had passed through many changes. The Inspired Version, A. B. Phillips, page 6. 23. Language difficulties. Hebrew was the written language for almost all 39 books of the Old Testament, but the Hebrew language had many disadvantages for English translators. It has a vocabulary unrelated to English words. It is also written backwards, from right to left, and has many sounds that are foreign to English forms and sounds. And, of course, the Hebrew alphabet is confusing to the eyes of its English readers, because so many letters look alike. 24. Missing texts. The two oldest and most valuable manuscripts of the Bible are the Vatican and the Sinai manuscripts, both written in Greek. They are believed to have been written in the 4th century. These documents are the principal source from which our Bible is taken. However, the Synecdoche manuscript does not contain the doxology in Matthew 6:13, Mark 16:9-20, John 7:53-8:11, nor Ephesians 1:1. These texts are also missing in the Vatican manuscript. This might mean they should not even be included in the Bible. The Vatican manuscript does not contain 1 and 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Revelations, nor the Book of Hebrews. This is another problem of major proportion for translators. 25. Inferior texts. It must be noted that the four most valuable manuscripts, the Vatican, the Sinaitic, the Alexandrian, and the Ephraim, were not even available in their original form to the King James translators. Hence, the basis for that Bible was translated from more inferior texts. 26. Obsolete and seldom used words. The King James Version contains many archaic words which are either obscure or misleading. Some of the words are obsolete, others are intelligible, but are cumbersome and distracting. For instance, hobeit, holden, aforetime, thee, thou, and thine are not commonly used today, but are understood. Other words used have a different meaning today than they did when first printed in the 17th century. Allege was used for prove, suffer for allow, let for hinder, and conversation for conduct, etc. 27. Different names. Sometimes names were different, but meant only one person. Jeremiah was also called Jeremias in Matt 16:14 and Jeremy in Matt 27:9. At first glance, one might suppose they were all different Old Testament prophets. Thus, there are many interchangeable names and words that are not properly written for our use and understanding. 28. Translator bias. Another problem has been the bias of the translators. The Vatican manuscript, obviously, was used as the basis of the Bible used by the Catholic Church. The Sinai manuscript is the basis for the Protestant Bible. In earlier years, there was a broad difference in the two translations, but more recently they are closer in comparison to each other. However, there are still many notable differences, thus showing either the inability or bias of translators to convey a correct interpretation from the original, depending on their own religious beliefs. The Catholic and Protestant versions concur in most points of importance, if they took their origin in suspicions of opposing parties, and the notes showed this strongly. The text and translation were dealt with honestly. Each has been repeatedly revised, and the modern editions are much nearer each other than those of the 16th century. Roman Catholic and Protestant Bibles compared, page 51. 29. Divisions and subdivisions. The division of the Bible into chapters and verses also has a negative result in some instances. The various divisions and subdivisions of the sacred scripture into chapters, verses, and members of sentences are of human authority, and to be regarded as such. Anciently, all the books of the sacred scriptures were written in one continuous manner without a break, a chapter or a verse. The division into chapters, that now universally obtains in Europe, derived its origin from Cardinal Cairo, who lived in the 12th century. The subdivision into verses is of no older date than the middle of the 16th century, and was the invention of Robert Stevens. Whatever advantages these divisions may have been in the way of facilitating references, they have so dislocated and broken to pieces the connection, as not only to have given the scriptures the appearance of a book of Proverbs, but have thrown great difficulties in the way of any of them. The punctuation, too, being necessarily dependent on these divisions, is far from accurate, and taken altogether it affords a demonstration that there is no more divinity in the chapters, verses, commas, semicolons, colons, and periods of the inspired writings than there is in the paper on which they are inscribed, or in the ink by which they are depicted to our view. Christian baptism. Alexander Campbell, page 39. 30. Uncorrectable errors. Unknown and uncorrectable errors can exist without having any way to correct them. That there are historical and chronological errors in our present Bible, no intelligent and candid person will deny. That some of these errors are the result of copying is probably true, but that they also resulted, and that the original autographs were absolutely free from error in all minor details, is what no man on earth knows or can prove, as the manuscripts are not in existence. Christian Evangelist, editor, 29802. 31. Theological omission. Omission of doctrine, principle, or teachings has led to questioning the authenticity of certain books in the Bible. Sometimes scholars suppose that if a NT author has omitted some aspect of theology, he could not have held it. For example, the absence from the Pauline epistles of any idea of Christ as high priest is for them evidence that he could not have held this idea. Yet he may have had reason for not including it in any of the epistles under his name in the NT. Arguments from silence are clearly less conclusive than contradictory evidence would be. It is reasonable to assume that an author would not knowingly contradict himself, yet it cannot be assumed that the totality of his doctrinal ideas is necessarily expressed in his extant writings. Biblical criticism, Harrison, etc., page 114. 32. Book arrangements. The arrangement of the books in the Bible has created certain problems, because they are not all found in chronological order. The one book of prophecy, the book of Revelation or Apocalypse, perhaps was not the last book of the New Testament to be written, but it suitably appears at the end of the Bible, since it summarizes in symbolic language the principles revealed in preceding books, and at the same time, gives a prophetic foretaste of things to come. How we got the Bible. Neil Lightfoot, page 23. The writing dates of many books in the Bible are not known, yet we now know that the last book of the Bible was not the last one written. Still, most Christians believe it was the conclusion and final inspired word from God to men. From this incorrect conclusion, they religiously believe that God was not going to send any more revelations or prophets to reveal them, as stated in Rev. 22:18-19. 33. Too many manuscripts. There have been only two alternatives for translators. 1. To select one manuscript and make it the standard text, or 2. To consult the thousands of manuscripts and authorities, and make a comparative translation by reconstructing them all. Since choosing one manuscript would surely result in an incomplete failure, the Bible has been composed from the latter method. This has not proved accurate, hence the many versions of the Bible today. 34. Inadequate texts. The publication of the King James Version of the Bible in 1611 was a milestone in Bible history. It was itself a revision of other translations and revisions. For centuries it remained the dominant Bible for English-speaking people. However, no translation can ever be final. Translators are human beings, and there will always be room for improvements upon their work. The King James Version was made from inadequate manuscripts. This is not the fault of the translators because they did not have many of the manuscripts which we now possess. As other more ancient and correct manuscripts are found, they will tend to make new revisions of the Bible. In fact, hundreds more recent Bible translations have been published since the King James edition. See Chapter 4, Different Bibles and Translations. 35. Numerous variants. There are so many manuscripts and pieces of manuscripts that it is difficult, if not impossible, to decide which ones are the most accurate. The quantity of materials available on the Bible, the number of textual documents, including manuscripts and versions, is so vast that it practically defies calculation. A conservative guess would be at least 20,000. Of these, as we have seen, some 4,500 alone are manuscripts of the New Testament. How we got the Bible. Neil Lightfoot, page 120. 36. Printer errors. Even after a manuscript is translated and given to a printer, there are still many errors that creep into the final printing. Yet problems arise and persist in the making of books. Today, with modern printing methods, it is not unusual to see glaring mistakes in published materials. Some of the greatest mistakes in the history of the Bible have occurred since the invention of printing. More than 300 errors in the first edition of the King James Bible were corrected in the second edition 2 years later. In our own time, despite all concentrated efforts to the contrary, the Revised Standard Version of 1946 and 1952 was not exempt from the plague of misprints. If in modern times errors somehow appear in printed copies of the Bible, it is not difficult to see how mistakes slipped unnoticed into the New Testament manuscripts long ago. All ancient books had to be produced by hand, and no human hand is so exact or eye so sharp as to preclude the possibility of error. So errors were made, errors were copied, and errors were mixed in with the pure text. How we got the Bible. Neil Lightfoot, page 46. 37. Incomplete texts. There have been no complete manuscripts from which to translate the Bible. Hence, certain manuscripts have been selected for use in publishing a complete New Testament or Bible as a whole. The number of our New Testament manuscripts is vast, about 4,500 in all. All of these, however, are not complete New Testaments. In fact, only a few contain anything like what could be termed a complete New Testament. How we got the Bible. Neil Lightfoot, page 28. 38. Inclusion. Other works were included in the manuscripts of the Bible, and for a while were considered scripture. Thus, whole books of the Bible have been questioned later as to their validity as scripture. At one time, the Sinaitic manuscript evidently contained the complete Old Testament, but much of it had been lost before its discovery by Tischendorf. Fortunately, the New Testament portion is intact, and includes also 2 other non-canonical books, known as the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas. These 2 manuscripts were not included in any standard Bible editions. How we got the Bible. Neil Lightfoot, page 35. 39. Canonizing. None of the books of the Bible was ever canonized as scripture by any religion council. This raises the question of what verses, chapters, or books of the Bible are scripture, or which should be considered as non-scripture. And, if new manuscripts are found, who can determine or say with authority that they are or are not scripture? Through the years, as further study of these old manuscripts is undertaken, more questions arise concerning the validity of some Bible stories and teachings. For instance, the authenticity of the story of the adulterous woman, John 7:53-8:11, is questioned by nearly all translators as to actually being recorded by John. Why? Simply because it is not recorded in any of the earliest manuscripts. The only early manuscript containing the story is the Codex Basil, which is known for many of its peculiar readings. Only manuscripts from the 8th century and later tell that story, and some of these manuscripts have marginal notes expressing doubts as to its validity. Some manuscripts place the story at the end of the Gospel of John, while others insert it in the Gospel of Luke. The American Standard Version of the Bible encloses it in brackets, indicating doubt in the minds of the translators as to its origin. The Revised Standard Bible puts the story in a footnote. So, where did the story come from? No one really knows. Other verses in question are those found at the end of Mark's Gospel. Again, in the American Standard Version, the verses are enclosed in brackets, and the Revised Standard Version puts them in a footnote. The evidence against Mark 16:9-20 is compounded because of its absence in the Vatican and Sinaitic manuscripts. And these two manuscripts from the 4th century are the best and oldest that are available. Furthermore, those verses are not found in the old Syriac manuscripts either. All of this lends doubt to the authenticity of many biblical verses and parables. 40. New text discoveries. As scholars probe deeper into newly found manuscripts and additional historical discoveries, and more deeply analyze existing research, they discover that some records are not based upon correct or previous assumptions. For instance, scholars are generally agreed that Paul did not write Hebrews, although it cannot be maintained that it was impossible for him to have done so, because he did not elsewhere mention the high priestly theme. Biblical Criticism, Harrison, etc., page 114. Therefore, since the authorship of Hebrews is questionable, can we still classify it as scripture? Revelation is another book that has been subjected to a variety of source theories. These range from the view that the book was originally a Jewish apocalypse, modified and enlarged to present a Christian viewpoint, to the idea that its author drew his imagery from various Jewish apocalypses. Biblical Criticism, Harrison, etc., page 104. The Book of Revelation is not included in the Vatican manuscript, therefore adding to the question of its validity. 41. Loss of original sources. The vast majority of the errors in the NTMSS occurred during the period that is also the most difficult to reconstruct, the first 4 Christian centuries. Much of the difficulty stems from the work of the earliest Christian copyists. In a time when the majority of people were illiterate and when Christianity periodically underwent severe persecution, there were probably few professionally trained scribes in the service of the church. Moreover, seldom were the scribes possessed by the spirit of the scribes of later times, who worked according to the instructions of the Lord given in Deuteronomy 12:32. Thou shalt not add thereto, nor diminish therefrom. In fact, the opposite seems to have been true of the scribes in the first 2 centuries. They introduced thousands of changes into the text. To be sure, the majority of their errors were unintentional and are easily discernible slips of the eye, ear, or mind. Hundreds of changes in the text were, however, made intentionally. Yet we should not think of these scribes as having acted from evil motives. If they often took many liberties in copying their texts, apparently they did so in most cases in an attempt to help out. They were more interested in making the message of the sacred text clear than in transmitting errorless MSS. Thus early scribes, and sometimes later ones, often smoothed out the Greek of the biblical writer by adding conjunctions, changing tenses of verbs, and changing word order. They also tended to clarify ambiguous passages by adding nouns or pronouns, by substituting common synonyms for uncommon words, and sometimes even by rewriting difficult phrases. There are also some instances, and these are usually very important ones, where scribes have added, or less often, subtracted, whole sentences or narratives in the interest of doctrine or completeness. Biblical Criticism, Harrison, etc., pages 138-139. Had original manuscripts been available, scribes would probably not have taken so many liberties in their translations. Summary. Because there are so many manuscripts that disagree, so many different Bibles, and so many errors in them all, scholars have lost a certain confidence in any finished Bible. From the early Christian fathers to the modern intellectuals, they have voiced their extreme displeasure with the translators. For example, Augustine often had to attempt a justification of the many conflicting passages of the Bible. Origen wrote a large book trying to clarify many of the Bible's discrepancies. Neander, an excellent scholar, never even attempted to justify all the contradictions after noting so many. Many of our most recent scholars of the Bible have written much concerning the glaring inconsistencies, self-contradictions, and manifest discrepancies of the Bible. The learned scholar, Moses Stuart, said the scriptures have discrepancies between different portions of them, which no learning nor ingenuity can reconcile. Dr. Charles Hodge declared, it would require not a volume, but volumes, to discuss all the cases of alleged discrepancies. Orson Pratt referred to Bishop Ussher's discouragement with all the differences in manuscript texts. In my hearing, Bishop Ussher professed that whereas he had of many years before a desire to publish the New Testament in Greek, with various lections and annotations, and for that purpose had used great diligence, and spent much money to furnish himself with manuscripts, yet, in conclusion, he was forced to desist utterly, lest, if he should ingenuously have noted all the several differences of reading which himself had collected, the incredible multitude of them almost in every verse, should rather have made men atheistical, than satisfy them in the true reading of any particular passage. Eximal. Ca. 8. New. 3. As quoted by Orson Pratt, J.D. 728. As far back as 1659, William Kilburn wrote about the dangerous errors that had already been published in the Bibles. He claimed to have discovered 20,000 errors in 6 editions of the King James versions alone. See Cambridge History of the Bible, page 363. If anyone wishes to see some of the additions that have been inserted into the Bible, let's turn to any page and notice the words printed in italics. These are words and phrases that the translators have added to the original text to help clarify or to try to correct it. It is reported that from the year 1611 to 1870, the number of italicized words increased from 43 to 583 in the Book of Matthew alone. See The Bible in America, P. Marion Sims, page 97. Unfortunately, we have no original manuscripts from which to obtain an absolutely correct version of the Bible. There are no early manuscripts from Asia Minor or Palestine, from which the original sources would have come. The original Old Testament manuscripts were copied by hand for many generations on highly perishable papyrus and animal skins in the relatively damp, hostile climate of Palestine. Within only a few years, these original manuscripts were consumed to oblivion, as copies of copies were made by both learned and unlearned copyists. Minor and major changes began to appear. Many scribes unintentionally made minor errors. Then some made intentional errors by trying to correct what they thought was an error. Variations accompanied almost every copy as corrections or interpretations began to appear. Later scholars have tried to sort and select which variations seemed most likely to agree with their own understanding of what the original writer intended. Hence, another reason for so many different Bible versions in existence today.